So this week I'm tracing down a few issues with my gauges. I got my mechanical temperature gauge back, reinstalled back in the Stag. Took the car for a drive and then went to the petrol station to fill up the Stag. And then what I noticed, with the tank full, because the pump automatically stops when I filled about 10 gallons, the fuel gauge only read halfway through, half full. It was working before, to be honest, I don't remember the last time I looked at it, but everything was working fine. So I'm also wanted to make sure the temperature gauge is working, because even with this, I've gone back to my old temperature gauge. This was reading low. I took it for a spin. It was reading somewhat on the low side, but my mechanical one was reading a lot higher. Now with the electrical temperature gauge, the idea is just get used to where it is and then get comfortable with the car. So this is my manual Stag. This manual Stag, the temperature gauge was always pretty consistent, whereas in my automatic Stag, the temperature gauge would vary depending on how hard I drove the car. Now, because I thought, well, usually the first thing I do the last time I had an issue with the temperature sensor, I actually replaced it with another one. There's a line, and you can see the color here. It's black and green, green with a black tracer. This actually goes to the sender in the fuel tank at the back. So usually what you can do is normally what I would have done is, if I suspected something wrong with the fuel gauge, I'd go into the fuel tank, disconnect that line and connect it to ground. And what you would see, I have my power off. I always keep the power off on this car, so I'm just mainly walking through what I would do. What you would see is that the gauge would go to full deflection, to full. But in this case, since I'm working behind the dashboard, I disconnected this line. I've jumped it with a wire. It's connected to the connector, and I grounded this wire to a known ground source, and in this case it's one of the lights. So this moved to full deflection, so it's nothing wrong with the gauge. It's nothing, I don't think, wrong with the voltage stabilizer, even though on this car it is a bit rusty, but it seems to be, I'm assuming it's working okay. Here's the voltage stabilizer. Typically I think the dark green one is the one that supplies, and then the light green one is the one that goes out to the respective gauges. One of them goes to the fuel gauge, and one of them goes to the temperature gauge. And anyway, I just thought I'll talk about how to test. You can do the same thing also with the temperature gauge. If you suspect your temperature gauge has a problem with that, you can disconnect the line to the temperature gauge, which is this blue and green wire, it looks like. Blue and green wire from the temperature sender, and connect it again to ground. And if you get full deflection, then you know the temperature gauge is working. I might have told you that I had to run a new line to this gauge directly, because I taped it off at the other end. Now, another thing that pops up quite often is people say their dashboard light doesn't work, or any of the dashboard lights don't work. So usually what happens is, the source of that could be a problem is, you'll see the dashboard light cable is red with white tracer. The source could be this rheostat thingy on the side. I can't show you now, but if you turn the knob and it should come on, it may not come on. I have LEDs, it doesn't really work too well, but what you can physically do is disconnect those two wires. There's two wires connected to that. There's actually four wires, but there's two crimps, two connectors. You physically take them off the rheostat and you join them together. You can make a jumper wire with two male spade connectors. That's easy enough. And then once you've joined it, you've bypassed that thing, and then you can see if your lights work. Now, also another thing I noticed is the speedo and the tachometer, and the other way around, sorry, they get a ground wire which is attached to the base of the gauge. So sometimes, I don't know if you can see my hand there, but it's here. Sometimes when you pull the gauge dash dials out, you pull them in, you could potentially disconnect that ground wire, and then your lights to the tacho and speedo stop working. But if you've lost all lights, it's most likely that rheostat. If you've lost one or two lights, most of these gauges have a live wire and the ground connected. Here's one for my clock. Here's one. I added an external oil gauge on in the vent side. Here's an external one. I jumped it with some more connectors I got from Alibaba. Again, ground and a red. You'll notice the voltage gauge also has a ground and a red, and I think the temperature gauge, it fell out, but here it also has a ground and a red. This, I don't know if you can see that, that's the sort of LED that I've got. I might have recommended them in another video. So yeah, I'm trying to trace some electrical issues. I had to pull the thing out. You want to be careful. This is a left-hand drive Stag. I got my Mark 1 clock rebuilt by somebody. You can see his name is there. He actually fixed Jaguar clocks. I had to undo the adjustment mechanism because otherwise it won't let me pull the dash out. You also have to be careful that sometimes it gets caught here, so you just have to wiggle it out. It might be also this connector. There's a wire, I think a clamp up here which holds the wire. You may have to wiggle it again. If you see me, I pulled my dash out and I put this little cushion on there because it sits on the steering wheel. And usually, as you can see, it's already the varnish is already flaking off, but I will eventually do that. I think I had to change this wire once. This one broke, so it's just joined. I think I might have mentioned in one of my videos those solder wire connectors, which are pretty good. And here's one of the ones I had done with shrink wrap and solder, but those things I'd shown in the other video were pretty handy. Anything else to point out while I have it open? So yeah, I'm trying to figure out the fuel gauge. I may eventually, so going back to the fuel gauge, sorry, so it does deflect correctly. So that means the problem is in the sender end. So what I will do is I will reconnect this black, green and black wire back onto the gauge and have a look in the boot and ground the wire at that end to see if it's working, just to make sure there's no issue with the wire. It could be that my float possibly has fuel in it and it's not showing full, but unfortunately when I fill up my gas, my petrol, I usually fill it up to the brim. It goes up all the way to the pipe, so I have to run the car for a bit because I know if I undo the fuel gauge, it's going to be petrol coming out of the sender unit, so I have to be careful with that. This is a Mark 1 Stag. I'm assuming you'd have the same sort of issues with the Mark 2 Stag if you have problems, but as I said, if your fuel gauge isn't working, you can take this wire off, ground it, it should deflect. And typically people complain about their voltage stabilizer. What happens, the output of the voltage stabilizer should be 10 volts, but if it goes to 12 volts, then your gauges read a lot higher. So people say, hey, my temperature gauge is reading super high, what could be going on? It could be this voltage stabilizer. You want to be careful. I heard lots of horror stories about the voltage stabilizer. The aftermarket one's not really working that great. I think in US there's somebody actually making a fancy one for about $20 or $25 that may work. It's made out of a handful of components. But yeah, this is a bit of a long video on my dashboard. As I said, I'm still trying to investigate what's going on with my fuel gauge, and I will see how the temperature gauge works. Maybe that low temperature gauge is the new norm, and that's something I have to get used to. But I will probably report back later when I put it back together. Another thing you may want to be careful, if you look at these screws, they have a little top washer on the end. They can fall off and you lose them. It's basically to stop the varnish chipping, and so you want to be careful with that. I have a Mark 1 Federal Stag, and this thing broke. This is the sorry, let me get this. This is the hazard light switch for a Mark 1 Federal Stag. I broke one and couldn't find anything, and I had to spend $50 on eBay for this, so that made me cry. But yeah, that was it. That's my hazard light on my Mark 1. Okay, well, happy fault finding, and that's it for now.